Respond to it.
Moana Maki.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I think nowhere is it more clear than in Part 2 of this particular bill how rotten and how inadequate this piece of legislation is. Because Part 2 deals with the transitional provisions relating to reorganisation proposals. And as other members have pointed out, it is how we carry out the reorganisation of local government that is critically important. And yet Part 2 is about 5 or 6 sentences long. That is all that is in Part 2 of this bill. Now, the Select Committee wanted to know some of the detail about what actually was going to be required when the transitional provisions were released, and we were given a little bit of information. It's extraordinary that Local Government New Zealand wasn't even consulted on this particular aspect of the legislation until the Select Committee demanded that their input be taken into account. And I thought it was very interesting in Part 1 of the bill, a couple of interjections from the Honourable Dr Nick Smith, who is soon to return to the portfolio of Minister of Local Government, when someone was making comments about Local Government New Zealand, and he called out that they were self-serving and nothing more than a union. Now, of course, coming from the National Party, calling someone a union is the ultimate kind of denigration that you could possibly come up with. We don't think that it's quite the insult that obviously the Honourable Dr Nick Smith thinks that it is, but the reality is Local Government New Zealand is not a union. They are not self-serving. They are the mayors and councillors around this country who are democratically elected to represent their communities. They know far better what is needed on the ground in terms of local government legislation than the Honourable Dr Nick Smith does, or indeed any member of this House. They come together as a group to discuss issues of importance to local government. They are there as a resource for parliamentarians to use when considering changes to local government legislation. They are not self-serving. They know what they're talking about. They are the people at the coalface every day doing the stuff that the Honourable Dr Nick Smith only talks about. We don't think they're self-serving on this side of the House. We think they should be listened to. And it is interesting that a number of them are National Party members, particularly in the provinces. And Nick Smith says the good ones. Well, whether they're good or bad or indifferent, they are not happy with you, Dr Smith. Not happy at all. In fact, I have a number of provincial mayors in the area that I live in who I know are National Party supporters who are furious with this legislation. Furious that the Minister is refusing to listen, especially on issues around reorganisation and how those are transitioned through, because there are no guidelines. You don't even have to show that there's going to be a positive benefit for the communities involved for reorganisation to go ahead. So we know that the Honourable Dr Nick Smith doesn't like local government democracy. He said that he stopped the elections for Environment Canterbury, the regional council in Christchurch, because he was worried about the outcome. Such is the nature of democracy. Such is the nature of having a democratic process where the people get to choose instead of the Minister of Local Government who represents them on their local council. It might be annoying for a government sometimes that they might not get the people that they'd hoped the good people of Canterbury would elect, but that's just the reality of democracy, unfortunately, and it shouldn't be being undermined in the way that it is being undermined in Part 2 of this legislation. Because, as my colleague Annette King pointed out when she discussed her proposed amendments to Clause 27, surely it's not too much to ask that when local government reform is happening, it must comply with a few basic principles, one being that it must be evidence-based. And I'd be interested, we've now had 3 ministers in the chair who've all sat there like dried arrangements, not even looked up from their papers. I don't even know if they know what bill we're discussing, but it would be nice to actually have some input from a minister on this very important piece of legislation. Why is it too much to ask that local government reform be evidence-based, have a clear and robust rationale, and be derived following consideration of key options and what each would achieve? So all we're saying is there are many ways you could reform local government, many different ways you could do. There are different councils you could combine together. There are different structures you could come up with. I note that the Wellington City Council has put up their own proposal for a one-tier structure of a Wellington super city that differs from the other proposal. So there are many numerous and different ways that you could do it. Why is it unreasonable that the legislation should say, one, you don't go in with no evidence and make these changes. You have to be able to explain clearly why this is a good thing for the communities that are involved, Mr. Chair. Thank you. Why this is a good change for the communities involved, but probably most importantly, that you've actually considered all the options available, not just one single option that might be being pushed by a certain group or a certain person, and there's been references to people that Dr Nick Smith has met with who have their own preferences around what a Wellington reorganisation might look like. Surely we should be saying that if you are going to take this major step of reorganisation, which is going to be costly, which is going to be disruptive, that on the other side there are clear benefits, they're evidence-based, but that you considered every possible option that would be available in that reorganisation. That we didn't just go with the preferred option of the Minister of the day, who has probably his own preferences and his own ideological bents that he wants to see come through in that, or a proposal from the opposition which is going to have different priorities and different focuses, or a proposal from Federated Farmers or Business New Zealand or different community organisations that represent different ethnic groups. There are so many different ways it could be done, and yet this legislation is silent on it. It basically says the government can do what they did in Auckland, come up with the one structure that they want, regardless of whether the people in that district want it. That's the only option you're going to get. We don't have to consider anything else. We don't have to have any evidence. There doesn't even have to be any benefit to it. That's okay. And that's what Part 2 of the bill currently says. And I want to know from the Minister and the Chair why, as I'm assuming he will, why is he going to vote down such a common sense approach which provides protections for the ratepayers. We've heard a lot of talk from the National Party about ratepayers here tonight, and yet the National Party is denying ratepayers around the country one of their most fundamental rights, the right to make their own decisions about the future of their local government organisations and not have anything imposed on them from above. Because currently, in order for a reorganisation to happen or an amalgamation to happen, it has to have the approval by referendum of all the different communities involved. So each council that is going to be amalgamated has their own referendum. If one of them says no, it doesn't happen, which is what happened in Dr Smith's own patch. So it says, if you look at an area like the Bay of Plenty, where the bulk of the voting strength is in Tauranga and the Western Bay of Plenty, a number of the social issues that local government have been really active in engaging with and working on are in the Eastern Bay of Plenty, which doesn't have the same population base. That we're not saying to Kawerau or to Opotiki or to Whakatane or to Rotorua for that case, basically, if the Western Bay of Plenty votes for it, sorry, you're just going to have to suck it up and live with it. Because currently it doesn't say that. It says you have to convince all these communities that it's in their best interest, otherwise it doesn't go ahead. And what that means is that the work does get done on the ground beforehand. All those negotiations happen because they know that if any one of those communities says no, then it's not going to go ahead. So they make sure that the protections are in place for those communities that have concerns. It provides an incentive for that work to be done early, for it to be done genuinely, for it to be done comprehensively, before it gets near a referendum. Well, that's going in this legislation. So now, again, the will of the majority will be imposed on the minority. And that is very concerning for communities that have high levels of poverty, where the local mayors are active in highlighting those issues, where they're active in initiatives like the Mayor's Task Force for Jobs, which will no longer be under the mandate of local government once this piece of legislation passes. It says to those communities that actually what you care about doesn't really matter, provided the majority push it through. We don't think that there need to be any kind of guidance around how these reorganisations happen, because what the national government knows is that if they actually went through a robust process along the lines of the SOP that my colleague Annette King has put together, it would slow it down, it would highlight the flaws in what the government is trying to push through, because there would actually be time to consider all the issues, time to engage with all the stakeholders. And Annette King's SOP requires that all relevant stakeholders be consulted and worked with, and that those negotiations happen in good faith. And we know that when these processes are subjected to the scrutiny that they should be subjected to, that a lot of what the government wants to push through simply won't fly. When there's time to give proper consideration, the flaws will be highlighted. That's why they want to rush it through. That's why there's provisions earlier on in this bill for the minister to actually be able to cancel elections. cancel local government elections so that instead of having a process that goes over maybe 3 years and is informative, they want to ram it through so that we can get this in place. And if we have to delay Wellington's elections by a year, well, who cares? We'll just push it out for a year because we need to get this done right now, because if we allow the proper time, the flaws will be highlighted.
Paul Goldsmith.
Oh, no.
Now put.
Denise Roche.